Hello and welcome. Tonight we start with the final chapter in the life of Elizabeth, England's last Tudor monarch and a ruler whose legend has touched countless lives. During her reign, she saw England grow rich in art, triumph on the battlefield, and carve out a place in the world. But beyond the splendor, she was simply a woman, and her passing remains wrapped in mystery. Before we settle in, I invite you, if you truly enjoy these stories, to like this video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always so special to see this community gather from around the globe. Now, lower the lights, maybe let a gentle fan fill the room with soft noise, and let's drift together into tonight's history. By the winter of 1602, Elizabeth approached her 70th year, an age rarely seen in Tudor England. The pale beauty of her powdered face began to show its age. Those dazzling red wigs, once a sign of youth and strength, now crowned a body worn down by years of solitary rule. For 44 years, she had faced all challenges alone. She survived plots, outlived many who opposed her, and kept rivals at bay. Still, as the new year arrived, those close to her saw change. Her appetite faded. Her attendance at court was rare, and the brilliance that once filled the halls at Whitehall seemed faint. Quiet rumors began among servants, whispers that their queen was beginning to slip away. Her sorrow was deepened by a personal blow. In 1601, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, was executed for treason. Though he had betrayed her with rebellion, Elizabeth loved him in her own way. Some believed it was the affection of a mother. Others imagined a more secret attachment. Regardless of the nature, watching him face the scaffold wounded her deeply, and she never fully healed after. That final winter, she spent hours on her feet, rarely sitting or lying down. Servants commented that she barely ate or spoke. When she did talk, her voice was thin, almost like smoke rising from the ashes. She would often stare at her cold hearth for hours, unmoving, as if transfixed by another world only she could see. Preparations began quietly inside the palace. Physicians offered potions and whispered prayers. Ministers urged her to rest, to eat, or to choose a successor. But the same will that had led her country so fiercely refused all comfort. Whatever trouble weighed on her seemed heavier than politics, perhaps heavier than the crown itself. As March drew near, those closest to Elizabeth understood. Her reign was ending, not with great fanfare, but tender sorrow. In Richmond Palace, sadness deepened every day. The once vibrant court, alive with music and talk, grew quiet. Elizabeth, once the heart of her kingdom, became still, wrapped in rich silks, surrounded by gloom. She stopped holding counsel. The usual walks in the garden were set aside. Slowly, her most trusted ladies were sent away, one by one, until she was mostly by herself. Even those few allowed to stay, like Lady Scrope, spoke softly, not knowing if their companionship eased her or made things harder. Behind closed doors, the Queen's mind seemed to wander. She turned away from food, refused sleep, and would remain standing for long stretches, by her bedside or gazing through the window, almost as if lying down meant inviting death closer. Eventually, when her legs failed, she'd sit upright, eyes fixed somewhere unseen, her lips moving quietly in thought or prayer. Some believed she feared letting go, not of life as a woman, but as a ruler. For so long she had been England's figurehead, her own will tied to that of an entire nation. Letting go would mean surrendering all she had controlled. Day by day, her strength slipped. She developed a cough, and her complexion turned paler still. Her elegant clothing draped loosely over a frame growing alarmingly thin, but she would not allow any detailed examination. Even in illness, her pride held firm. Among the courtiers, one question lingered. Was it simply age, or something more hidden? None dared ask, and Elizabeth herself kept the answer to herself, her once commanding words now barely above a whisper. To truly grasp what pressed down on Elizabeth in those last weeks, you must think not just of her failing health, but of the grief weighing on her soul. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, had been both a favorite and a source of strife. Handsome, bold, unpredictable. He showered her with compliments, broke her trust, begged forgiveness, then betrayed her again. In him, she saw promise and danger. She had raised him high, gave him influence, but his craving for power overcame him. His failed coup forced her hand. Treason could not be pardoned, no matter the culprit. Elizabeth herself signed the command for his beheading, and with his death, something within her seemed to fall apart. Witnesses said she was never the same again. It went beyond sorrow. There seemed to be a guilt that never left her. Some said she cherished a small locket with his portrait, or whispered his name in the darkness. True or not, these stories reflect a change none could deny. The Queen appeared vulnerable, even wounded. In that era, grief was little understood. What we now see as depression could be called a spiritual imbalance. Her eyes lost their spark. Her laughter faded. Those who once sought her favor now stepped gently around her, unsure how deep her sorrow might go. She stopped corresponding, left documents unsigned, and even missed chapel, something startling, given her devout Protestant faith. She no longer wanted music, once her joy and comfort. For Elizabeth, the loss was not just of a companion, but of her own spirit. As the spring of 1603 arrived, the Queen's decline could no longer be hidden, no longer just private. Her fading was visible to all, from nobles and ministers to terrified maids. Elizabeth, once so vibrant and clever, now seemed lost in her own palace. She barely spoke, answering with simple gestures. Rarely did a sentence pass her lips. When urged for direction or a decision about succession, she would turn away, withdrawing further. Physicians came urgently, debating causes. Some saw a disturbance of bodily humors, others suggested trouble in her mind. No remedies made a difference, as the truth remained hidden from even the wisest. Her refusal to lie down became almost a symbol. She stood, or perched on cushions, but would not recline fully, as if believing sleep would bring her last moments closer. Later, servants would recall seeing her motionless in a dark corner, draped in heavy cloth. They watched her, unsure if she mourned, prayed, or simply wandered far from them in thought. Over time, even the palace itself grew quiet and tense. Gentlemen waited by the door. Whispers filled the hallways. Fear did not come from losing a queen alone, but from uncertainty about what would follow her. England had no certain heir. Elizabeth had never named one. Still, many expected James, King of Scots, would eventually be chosen. But until she spoke, nothing was certain, and the silence stretched across both court and kingdom. Amid the uncertainty, some wondered if her illness was not from age or heartbreak, but something more troubling. For decades, Elizabeth wore her iconic white makeup, a thick mask called Venetian ceruse. It was admired among nobles and signaled both wealth and power. Yet, its very recipe mixed vinegar with white lead, a poison now well known to us. Layer upon layer, this makeup was absorbed into her skin. Over the years, it could cause nerve damage, weaken the body, cloud the mind, even shorten life. The effects of chronic lead exposure, lethargy, sadness, trembling hands, fading memory, and damaged skin, were noted by those around her. Her teeth blackened and fell out, her vivid hair thinned. Sores appeared beneath the makeup's cover. Still, Elizabeth held steadfast to her carefully crafted image, a white mask, her shield, and her denial of weakness. Some now believe that slow lead poisoning helped bring about these changes. Erratic moods, confusion, inability to eat or sleep, even a deepened depression after Devereux's death But in her lifetime, the dangers were not understood. Venetian ceruse was considered fashionable. It was imported, admired, and worn across Europe. Perhaps what made Elizabeth memorable also hastened her quiet undoing. The mask became both her legacy and her undoing. By mid-March 1603, her decline was obvious to all. Courtiers moved with growing urgency, but hid their distress. Elizabeth had stopped eating altogether. Now she seemed to shrink within the vast, beautiful robes she wore. Yet, just as no doctor could name her disease, none knew how to treat it. Tudor medicine was primitive. Imbalanced bodily humors explained everything. So treatments involved herbs, bleeding, or cleansing, none of which helped as the Queen slipped further away. Modern scholars have considered several possibilities. Perhaps she suffered pneumonia, likely worsened by cold palace air and days spent standing without nourishment. Others suspect she may have developed blood poisoning, perhaps from infected teeth or sores hidden beneath her makeup. Dental care was minimal, and Elizabeth had lost many teeth. Infection could enter the bloodstream with fatal consequences, but these diagnoses are offered from a distance, as nothing could be confirmed in her day. Elizabeth received little treatment. She refused medicines, would not be bled, and resisted undressing even for doctors. Her dignity remained intact until the end. Through it all, she remained quiet. Around her, servants moved gently. Her women wept in private, and her ministers became silent bystanders, watching a giant presence slowly diminish, not in sudden collapse, but in flickers, like a candle's dying glow. It was not just failing health that burdened her, but the incredible exhaustion of rule itself. For more than 4 decades, she had been the living symbol of England. Every moment, every speech, every decision bore the weight of a nation. Now, as she lingered in stillness, the crown rested near her, but unclaimed. The future of the throne was now the great, silent question. Without marriage or children, the Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth. Naming a successor may have been too much for her. The act itself meant accepting mortality and closing a powerful era. Rumors swirled that she nodded or made vague gestures when asked if James of Scotland should be her heir. Others remembered her brushing aside the question with a sharp remark, only to relent later. What is certain is, she never spoke her final choice. To the end, perhaps she could not admit this was truly the end. Not just of her story, but of an entire royal line. That, maybe, was a burden greater than death. As March wore on and the weather chilled, those with Elizabeth faced a strange and troubling truth. She refused to sleep, not just at night, but altogether. Night and day stretched into a watchful stillness. Her body grew weaker, yet she would only sit or stand, rarely yielding to fatigue. Attendants pleaded with her to rest, but she resisted so fiercely that eventually they stopped trying. There was more here than stubbornness, perhaps superstition, perhaps dread. In her era, sleep was seen as close to death, a state where the soul could slip away. Elizabeth, for all her sharp mind, may have felt that lying down would hasten her passing. So she sat, slumped or leaning, stubbornly upright despite swollen legs and labored breath. Her servants tried to comfort her, offering music or warm drinks. She pushed them away, wanting neither soothing nor persuasion. There was a sense she was holding vigil over her own ending, unwilling to surrender. At last, her strength failed. She collapsed, found at times crumpled on the floor, unwilling to call for help. Her ladies took turns by her side, quiet and attentive, only speaking if she addressed them. The room was thick with sadness and respect. A hush fell over it, a place where death felt near. Eventually, she allowed herself to be placed in bed, not from peace, but because exhaustion left her with no other choice. She was tucked into her sheets by gentle hands, as if being laid in state even before death. Those closest to her sensed the closing of an era, the last breath of the Tudor line. The chamber grew dim and reverent, filled with the quiet steps of those who loved and served her. No proclamations or fanfare marked the moment. Candles flickered, and outside, all of Richmond Palace seemed to pause. Elizabeth never spoke again. Where once her words roused armies or stilled debating halls, now she communicated only by the faintest gestures, a nod, a gaze, a trembling hand. Some claimed she reached for her crown, others that she gestured towards a portrait of James of Scotland. There was no final speech, no clear farewell. What she saw in those silent hours, no one knows. Maybe flashes from her life. A young girl imprisoned, a leader at Tilbury, adventures at a glittering court, religious fires, the sorrowful deaths of kin and companion. Her soul, shaped by triumph and loneliness. Beyond her room, quiet preparations began. Courtiers packed possessions, ambassadors drafted messages, messengers readied their horses. They waited for the end, knowing the country would be rudderless until the monarch slipped away. In Elizabeth's last hours, those by her side stood silent and sorrowful. Her breathing grew shallow. Her skin, pale before, faded further to gray, and the steadfast flame within her seemed finally to go out. Lady Scrope attended closely, holding the Queen's hand, brushing her brow with rose-scented cloth. Others murmured prayers, some in whispers, others in their hearts. No ritual could capture the uniqueness of her passing. Richmond Palace, heavy with unease, waited until Elizabeth had taken her last breath. Outside, messengers were poised to race to Scotland. Inside, time felt uneven. Each minute stretched painfully, none daring to speak of what would come after. Even Robert Cecil, who had prepared for this transition and would unite two crowns under one, stood quietly, his greatest work now hanging on the Queen's final breath. Shortly before sunrise on March 24th, 1603, it ended. There was no outcry, no loud goodbye, only silence. After a long pause, Lady Scrope gently covered her Queen's face. So ended the reign and life of Elizabeth. There were no trumpets, no priest's blessing. She had refused them all. The woman called the Virgin Queen died alone, surrounded not by family, but by the echoes of her remarkable reign. Born in scandal, tested by threats and war, she passed into legend as quietly as she had sometimes stood her ground, unbending, dignified, and always a little mysterious. Her death sent a chill across the land, not because it was a surprise, but because of the emptiness it left. A ruler for most people's lifetimes had vanished, and her figure hovered now only in memory and stories. Her image, seen on coins and in daily life, was suddenly still. By custom, her body was left undisturbed while her ladies kept vigil, softly reciting prayers. A single candle glowed at her bedside. The cloth across her face did not hide who she was. Instead, it allowed the nation a last chance to hold on to her presence. Yet, as sadness settled inside Richmond, wheels began to turn outside. Robert Cecil, more prepared than most, set his plans in motion. He had already reached out to James of Scotland, ready for this very moment. Couriers leapt to their posts, ready to spread the word that would change two kingdoms. In London, news was held quietly for hours, fearing disorder or unrest. But before long, word trickled out, first to servants, then merchants, then into churches. With Elizabeth's passing, the Tudors passed into history. There was no child, no sibling, no relative waiting to take her place. Only her silent wish, widely assumed, that James would follow her. The Privy Council met in anxious circles. knowing a single misstep might plunge the country into chaos. Past succession struggles lingered in memory. Violence was possible at any moment. Yet her long silence had given her ministers time to prepare. Within hours, James of Scotland was named as James I of England. A new chapter began, the era of the Stuarts, but the country looked back one last time, mourning a queen who had defined an age and left a silence no crown could easily fill. With succession settled, attention turned to Elizabeth's body. She had always cared deeply about her appearance, never wishing to be seen but flawlessly dressed and prepared. In life, as in death, her image protected her. She kept her room dim, visitors rare, and wore her symbols, white makeup, grand gowns, and bright wigs. Now, as her ladies cared for her remains, the truth emerged from beneath the mask. Her skin showed the toll of time and illness, marked by bruises and sores, the result of years using toxic cosmetics. Her hands, once strong, were frail. Her hair, hardly remaining, was thin and white. Even in these visible signs, her humanity came through. She was no longer an untouchable symbol, but a woman who had borne the weight of a nation. Elizabeth's body was not embalmed at once. Tradition called for delay, so the country could gather and mourn. She was dressed one final time in royal robes, with the crown beside her and the orb and scepter laid close. As people lined up to pay their respects, they grieved not only for their queen, but for the person beneath, a figure at once commanding and vulnerable. On April 28, 1603, over a month after her death, she was finally laid to rest. The country needed time. Mourning its longest-serving monarch demanded ceremony as grand as her legacy. The procession started at Whitehall, winding its way to Westminster Abbey. Crowds pressed close, nobles, ministers, townsfolk, all silent. No music was played, no laughter. Only the slow steps of pallbearers and tolling bells marked her final journey. Her coffin was draped with velvet and carried on a grand carriage drawn by 4 horses. Above, a lifelike figure of Elizabeth, dressed as she had been in life, crowned and holding her regalia, watched over the crowd. The likeness was so convincing that some believed it to be her real body, honored one last time. In a final act of family reconciliation, she was buried beside her half-sister Mary, once her rival and enemy. The tomb inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we 2 sisters, in hope of one resurrection." In death, the 2 were united, their old bitterness forgotten. Elizabeth's funeral marked an ending. The Tudor line, which had lifted England from civil war and into a golden age, was ended. As the doors of the Abbey closed, a new world waited, one that would be different in every way. Centuries have passed since those final moments, and the uncertainty that surrounded Elizabeth's death endures. Unlike monarchs struck down by battle or sudden sickness, her final days are woven from contradiction and quiet secrets. Scholars and doctors still wonder, what really caused the Virgin Queen's end? The most common belief is the simplest: old age. Nearly 70, she had lived longer than most. Her refusal of food and rest weakened her further, and without medical knowledge, even the smallest ailment could kill. Other theories suggest pneumonia, the cold, the hunger, the endless standing, all leading to a fatal infection. Still others point to lead poisoning from her trademark cosmetics, which could have damaged her organs, affected her mind, and made every symptom worse. There is also the possibility of blood poisoning from an untreated infection. Lost teeth and sores provided easy entry for disease. In a time with little understanding of germs, these would not have been recognized or treated properly. Finally, some believe that heartbreak and grief, especially after losing Robert Devereux, caused a deep, unresolved sadness that hastened her decline. But perhaps it was not any one thing, but all of these woven together. years of burden, solitude, loss, and exhaustion finally becoming too much. She left no explanation, only a legend. Elizabeth's passing was not just the end of a person, but the conclusion of an identity shaped by decades of lonely leadership. Her reign had no husband, no children. Her likeness became part of England's own self-image. She died quietly, her death wrapped in uncertainty, but the thunder of her era echoed far beyond. England had changed utterly in her lifetime. When she ascended the throne in 1558, the country was divided, threatened, unstable. By her will and guidance, it became proud, stable, and a force among nations. Her death, though, peeled away that confidence, reminding everyone how much had depended on her. The peaceful rise of James I was a victory for her ministers, but also marked a profound change. The Tudor age was over. A new dynasty carried the weight forward. But what lingered most wasn't the politics. It was her story. Her words at Tilbury, her refusal to be wed, her crafted image as the Virgin Queen, the elegance and symbolism that became legend, all remained. Even her final silence shaped her memory. She left the world as she often lived, on her own terms, unyielding, giving no last plea or confession. Historians debate her demise, but her impact remains beyond doubt. The Elizabethan age stands as one of England's brightest periods, blessed with creativity and optimism. Her name became a symbol of that golden time. Long after her body was placed in Westminster Abbey, her story endures, retold in books, performed on stage, and alive in echoes of leadership today. She died alone, but she will never be forgotten. Long before chocolate bars filled shops or mugs of cocoa warmed chilly nights, the cacao bean was something else entirely. Unsweetened, undiluted, and drunk as a bitter, sacred drink. For the ancient people of Mesoamerica, this odd and powerful seed was not just food, but meaning itself. Our journey begins over 3,000 years ago, in the deep green forests of southern Mexico. The Olmec, among the earliest advanced peoples in the Americas, are believed to be the first to cultivate this tree. While much about them is lost to time, evidence suggests they used cacao for rituals. Perhaps drinking it during ceremonies meant only for leaders or wise men. It was no ordinary refreshment. It was thought to hold spiritual power. With the Mayan civilization, cacao became a truly sacred gift. Between the 3rd and 10th centuries, the Maya flourished across Central America, and for them, cacao was bestowed by the gods themselves. According to Maya stories, the gods gave cacao to humans at creation. The Popol Vuh, a sacred book, tells of people made from maize and cacao, linking them to the earth in body and spirit. Cacao was reserved for important occasions. Priests offered it in religious rites. Nobles sipped it during lavish feasts. It was believed to enliven the soul and draw one closer to divinity. Served cold and mixed with chili or cornmeal, the thick drink was rich and invigorating. It was often poured from vessel to raise a fragrant foam, a sign of quality and honor. Yet cacao's power reached even further into everyday life. In Maya markets, cacao beans served as currency. You could buy a meal with a handful or a turkey with 100. People saved cacao as you would money, and inevitably some fashioned counterfeits from clay. For the Maya, cacao was more than taste. It was life, power, and even faith, the drink of gods that connected them to something greater. In Maya society, cacao was woven into all aspects of existence, a symbol of order and a bridge between worlds. In every major Maya city, cacao marked the most significant moments: the crowning of kings, the sealing of marriages, even the laying to rest of the dead, who were sent away with vessels of cacao for the next world. The drink was central in ceremonies, reserved mostly for priests and the elite, never indulged lightly. It could be blended with chili, maize, vanilla, and sometimes even blood, a mix believed to sharpen the senses and invite sacred insight. The Maya thought that sipping cacao could bring clarity from the gods. Cacao trees themselves were seen as holy. Their twisting branches and bright pods spoke of life and abundance. Artworks showed kings offering cacao to deities, and occasionally gods bursting forth from the pods, as if the plant itself was a doorway between realms. But cacao's meaning was not limited to worship. Social and economic life revolved around the drink, too. To host someone or make peace, you shared cacao, marking trust and unity. Even among the noble families, cacao drinking was performed with care. Beautifully painted vessels bore the names and purposes of their owners. These cups were not only practical but treasured and honored. This deep respect for cacao defined Maya culture and identity. It was not just consumed, but celebrated and trusted as a true link between earth, the heavens, and the unseen world. Centuries later, another grand civilization would take cacao even further: the Aztecs. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, cacao had become not only sacred in the Aztec Empire, but a crucial part of the economy, medicine, and royal life. Cacao trees would not grow in the cool highlands of the Aztec capital. Instead, beans were received as tribute from conquered territories. Tons of cacao arrived in the city, stored in secure buildings. Aztec granaries, in essence, operated like great banks. Cacao beans were used to pay salaries, buy goods, and settle debts. Even faking cacao could bring severe punishment. Cacao, now called chocolatl, was mainly prepared for the wealthy, priests, and warriors. The drink, made with chili and maize, was thought to give energy and mental clarity, especially before battle. Emperor Moctezuma II was rumored to drink dozens of cups a day, hoping for greater strength and vitality. For ordinary people, cacao remained far out of reach. A key part of religious rituals, cacao was offered to gods like Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who, according to legend, had given the seed to humanity by stealing it from paradise. Consuming cacao in the right way was therefore an act of reverence and connection. In Aztec life, cacao stood for power, war, worship, and wealth, a seed earned, bestowed, traded, and respected. But all this would be transformed with the arrival of Europeans. When Spanish explorers, led by Hernán Cortés, entered the Aztec capital in 1519, they encountered many wonders, yet the bitter drink served so often to nobles and rulers stood out as especially unusual. Though the Spanish at first found its taste hard to appreciate, they quickly noticed the respect it commanded and the energy it seemed to provide. When the conquest ended and the Spanish took control, Cortés carried more than gold and silver back to Europe. He brought cacao beans and the secrets of how to grind and mix them. At first in Spain, chocolate remained a curiosity, reserved for the highest circles of the court. Monks prepared it quietly for nobles, following the tradition of the Americas. But the European palate was different, and soon a key innovation emerged: sugar. Blending sugar with the bitter cacao transformed the drink into something sweeter, gentler, and far more appealing to Europeans. Chocolate moved from ceremonial ritual to noble treat, an indulgence, now craved by kings and queens, sipped hot instead of cold, and prepared without chili or maize. This new chocolate, though tamed for European tastes, came at a great cost. The demand for cacao and sugar grew fast, and in order to supply Europe's passion for sweets, colonial powers established vast plantations. These relied on slavery and the forced labor of millions, the bitter legacy behind a sweet new habit. The divine drink had crossed the ocean, and it would never be the same. By the 17th century, chocolate had gone from Mesoamerican ritual to fashionable European luxury. Yet, as its sweetness grew, so did a darker history. As cacao and sugar became essential ingredients, they became two of the most profitable crops in European colonies. Growing and harvesting them required intense, back-breaking labor, mostly provided by enslaved workers. Colonial empires, the Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and British, used slave labor to meet the rising demand. Millions of Africans were taken from their homes, forced onto ships, and put to work on plantations in the Caribbean, South America, and eventually West Africa. Many lived and died never even tasting the chocolate their hands helped create. The human cost was immense. Families were torn apart, cultures disrupted, and many lives lost or changed forever. In the smart salons of cities like London and Paris, the suffering behind every cup of chocolate was ignored, hidden behind the glow of privilege. Cacao had become a global commodity. No longer an offering to the gods, it now fueled trade, taxes, and the growing power of empires. As machinery improved and the world sped up, the hunger for chocolate only deepened. What began as a sacred, revered drink now carried with it the weight of oppression, even as its reputation for luxury and delight only grew. Through all this, chocolate's appeal never faded. It became a symbol of pleasure, joy, and even love, while its darker origins remained largely unspoken. Centuries passed, and for much of that time, chocolate was still mainly enjoyed as a drink for the wealthy and the few. Everything changed with the Industrial Revolution. In the early 1800s, a burst of new inventions in Europe transformed how chocolate was made and enjoyed. In 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad van Houten invented a hydraulic press to squeeze much of the fat, the cocoa butter, out of cacao beans. What was left was a dry powder, easier to mix with water, milk, or sugar, making chocolate less expensive and simpler to produce. This development, called Dutch cocoa, opened new doors. In 1847, Fry & Sons in Britain created the first modern chocolate bar by blending cocoa with sugar and adding back some cocoa butter. For the first time, chocolate became a solid treat, which could be held and shared, not just sipped from a cup. Soon after, Swiss innovators made further leaps. In the 1870s, Daniel Peter perfected milk chocolate by adding condensed milk, and Rodolphe Lindt's conching machine gave chocolate its rich, smooth texture. These changes made chocolate cheaper, creamier, and more appealing, especially to children and ordinary families. As chocolate sellers like Cadbury, Nestlé, and Hershey scaled up their factories, chocolate became available almost everywhere, wrapped in colorful packaging. Advertisements promised happiness and fun. Now chocolate was a household staple, a treat for all. But even as chocolate transformed into something sweet and simple, much of its ancient meaning was lost. The food of the gods was now a snack, stripped of ritual but filled with new delight. Still, a new era had begun, one that made chocolate a true global favorite. By the start of the 20th century, chocolate was no longer rare or exotic. It was a part of life for people all around the world. What had started as a sacred drink in the rainforests was now big business, shaped by industry, advertising, and commerce. In the United States, chocolate took on a new life. Milton Hershey in the late 1800s used mass production techniques to make milk chocolate bars for everyone, not just the wealthy. Like Henry Ford's cars, Hershey's chocolate became accessible to the average American, changing the treat from a rare luxury to an everyday pleasure. And so chocolate's journey continues, always changing, forever bridging worlds. By the turn of the 20th century, the classic Hershey bar appeared, introducing Americans to a lasting romance with chocolate. Something shifted. Chocolate was no longer simply a food. It started to represent something deeper. Soldiers packed it with them into battle. Children swapped chocolate squares at recess. Its rich flavor appeared in recipes, holiday celebrations, and matters of the heart. Valentine's Day, Halloween, and Easter each made chocolate their unofficial emblem. Its sweet taste became tied to love, comfort, and fond memories. All the while, worldwide companies pushed cacao farming to new frontiers to satisfy growing appetites. Countries in West Africa, especially Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, emerged as the centers of cacao production, outpacing places in Latin America. Ironically, these were the same lands once shaped by colonization and forced labor. Now, they provided the world with over 70% of its cacao, often at a great human cost. Harmful work conditions, including child employment and pay far below a living wage, have persisted in many cacao-growing areas, even today. Yet, in spite of these troubled origins, chocolate's popularity only soared. In Japan, it became a beloved craft, tiny, artful candies exchanged with thoughtful ceremony. In Switzerland, chocolate was a source of national pride, with famous brands shaping the standard for excellence. In Mexico, chocolate returned to its ancestral role, featuring in traditional recipes like mole, where bitterness and warmth blend together. Everywhere, chocolate's meaning kept evolving, universal but uniquely personal, a creation born from ancient rituals, changed by foreign empires, and ultimately defined by different cultures across the globe. From the mountains of South America to the shops of Belgium, and from Ghana's farms to the streets of Geneva, chocolate became woven into the story of humanity itself. Few pause today to reflect on its journey, but every taste carries echoes of its past, sweet, bitter, and everything in between. During times of fast-moving industry and far-reaching expansion, chocolate's old beginnings faded from memory. What once held deep spiritual significance was now just a delicious, convenient snack, sold in vast quantities every day. Recently, though, a quiet revival has begun. People are once again reaching back to chocolate's beginnings, returning attention to the humble bean. The craft chocolate movement started to take shape in the early 2000s, sparked by interest in coffee, wine, and the belief in a slower, more mindful approach to food. Small makers around the world began asking important questions. Where is our chocolate grown? Who tends the trees? What flavors lie beneath all the sugars and extras? They found their way back to the source, the cacao bean itself. Unlike mass-produced chocolate, which blends large amounts of beans from all over, craft chocolate focuses on single regions, highlighting the flavors of individual soils and different ways of fermenting the beans. Beans from Madagascar might taste lively, full of fruit, while those from Ecuador can be filled with floral or nutty notes. Chocolate, these artisans discovered, has terroir, just like fine wine. But this is not just about tasting distinct flavors, it's also about fairness and how chocolate reaches our hands. With greater knowledge came a spotlight on harsh conditions in cacao farming, stories of unpaid workers and children laboring in the fields. In response, many small chocolate makers chose to work closely with the farmers, paying higher prices for beans grown with care and respect. New labels like Fair Trade, Direct Trade, and Rainforest certifications appeared, each aiming to make chocolate's path to the table more just and earth-friendly. At the same time, chefs and food scholars looked back to Mesoamerican traditions, reviving old ways of using cacao in the regions where chocolate was first treasured. In parts of Mexico and Guatemala, drinks made from cacao, corn, and chili peppers became popular once more. Elders in local communities passed down recipes, reminding everyone that chocolate's story truly began in tropical forests, not modern factories. Museums, books, and food tours followed as people started to see chocolate not only as candy, but as a symbol of culture, rich in tradition, struggle, and storytelling. Though the world around it has changed in countless ways, chocolate at its heart remains simple. the fruit of a tree, harvested by hand, prepared with thoughtful care, and shared with purpose. For those who listen, chocolate still speaks, not only with sweetness, but with memories as well. Today, chocolate is present everywhere, from birthday parties and bake sales to vending machines in the finest kitchens. It is linked to feelings of hope, celebration, luxury, or comfort. But under its smooth coating lies a complicated past. Chocolate is a tale of ancient gods and powerful rulers, of joy and hardship, of ritual and constant innovation. It is perhaps the clearest reflection of our shared journey, from sacred ceremonies in mighty temples to the silent courage of those who, under bondage, brought cacao to new lands, from humble farms to royal drawing rooms, from army rations to romantic tokens exchanged on special days. Chocolate's meaning is layered. On the one side, it is a symbol of innovation and the blending of cultures, a perfect example of how ingredients and ideas move across continents to become entirely new creations. It has inspired scientists, artists, and poets. It has shaped advances in the kitchen from perfecting how it melts to finding just the right balance of tastes. On the other side is its shadow, a modern industry still relying on workers who live in poverty and, in some cases, have never tasted chocolate themselves. Despite growing movements for change, challenges like forest loss, unfair wages, and child labor remain. Chocolate is also the story of overlooked voices, the indigenous people who first honored cacao as something holy. Many of their customs were silenced by outside powers. Only in recent years have their contributions been truly recognized and their traditions revived. Whenever we enjoy a piece of chocolate or sip a cup of hot cocoa, whether we realize it or not, we touch a history that is both rich and often full of sorrow. Through all its contradictions, chocolate continues to bring people together, across languages, borders, and generations. It brings joy, offers comfort, marks celebrations, and endures. This might be chocolate's greatest quality, not just its flavor, but its power to grow, adapt, and last through every rise and fall in human history. From ancient roots to modern recipes, from the soil to the symbols it has come to represent, chocolate always means more than it appears to mean. In the end, it is not simply a treat, it is a living story, one that continues to unfold even now. In the first years of the 19th century, the United States was a young nation, filled with dreams of growth and expansion. Its population was booming, and settlers pushed ever farther into new territories, searching for land, riches, and new chances. For many, heading west seemed like a right granted by destiny itself. But the frontier they aimed for was not open wilderness. It was instead a land shaped by memory, community, and life, home to established native nations. Among these were peoples like the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. They had built strong governments, developed written languages, published newspapers, and built schools. Far from being wandering tribes, these were organized societies, many of whom had tried to find ways to live alongside the new American government through diplomacy and law. The Cherokee, especially, had adopted many customs from the United States as a way to protect their future. They wrote their own constitution, farmed the land, and many adopted Christianity. They printed newspapers in 2 languages and even sent representatives to Washington. Still, for the settlers and lawmakers moving into the South, it was never enough. What they truly wanted was the land itself. States such as Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi passed unfair laws, ignoring native authority and pushing to erase their rights to their own lands. When gold was found in northern Georgia, the pressure only increased. Many now believed those areas were too valuable to remain in native control. President Andrew Jackson, a former soldier and a strong supporter of removing native people, presented a clear solution: send native nations beyond the Mississippi River, far from the eastern lands settlers wanted. The goal was not simply policy, it became a belief, a vision known as manifest destiny, that white Americans were meant to spread from one coast to the other, no matter the cost, In the 1830s, this idea meant entire communities would be uprooted. This was the beginning, not of progress, but of one of America's saddest and most regrettable episodes, the Trail of Tears. On May 28, 1830, President Jackson signed into effect the Indian Removal Act, a law that changed the course of tens of thousands of lives. Though the act was painted as fair and voluntary, it actually led to a long and forceful campaign to push Native peoples out of their homeland in the Southeast. The law gave the president the power to make agreements, asking tribes east of the Mississippi to trade their lands for a new Indian territory out west in what is now Oklahoma. Supporters of the law claimed it would preserve Native peoples by moving them out of harm's way, but in truth, it was a land grab disguised as protection. Jackson himself, famous for fighting against Native nations, saw removal as the obvious next step in America's growth. He argued that Native and white communities could not live together, that removing Native nations was both right and unavoidable. He once said that Native peoples lacked the will and skills to advance, saying they must either fade away or give up their homes forever. Congress was closely divided, but the law still passed by just a handful of votes in both chambers. That was all it took to open the gates to a national tragedy. Some tribes, fearing what might happen if they resisted, agreed to move. Others tried to rely on treaties promising money, supplies, and safe passage. But these promises, sadly, would often go unkept. In reality, removing Native peoples was chaotic and violent. What was presented as a peaceful shift became a nightmare of broken deals, greed, and brutality. Families were torn from their homes, houses burned, fields destroyed. Soldiers arrived with orders demanding people leave behind almost everything, while settlers waited to take over the cleared land. The Indian Removal Act did not just move lines on a map. It broke generations of connection, destroyed lives, and revealed the hard truth. The growth of the United States was shaped not only by hope, but by heartbreak. While many tribes faced increasing calls to sign removal agreements, the Cherokee chose another approach. They turned to the courts. Determined to keep their independence, the Cherokee used the same American legal system that now threatened them. Guided by their leader John Ross, they set up a constitution, a government, and asserted their rights as a separate nation. By showing they had a structured society similar to the U.S., they hoped to protect their land. Their fight came to a head in two important Supreme Court cases. In the first, in 1831, the Cherokee requested an order against new laws from the state of Georgia that took away their rights. Led by Chief Justice John Marshall, the court decided that the Cherokee could not sue as a foreign nation, a terrible blow. But a year later, in a new case, the same court sided with the Cherokee, declaring that only the federal government could make laws for native lands. For a brief moment, it seemed justice might prevail. President Jackson, though, ignored the court's decision. Whether or not he actually said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." His response left no room for doubt. Georgia continued to push on to Cherokee land, and federal authorities did not intervene. The Constitution's ruling went unheard. Within the Cherokee Nation, hope remained, but divisions began to appear. A small group, led by Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, believed relocation could not be avoided. They signed a treaty in 1835 without full approval from their leaders, a deal passed by just a few votes in the Senate, yet it sealed the Cherokee's fate. So the Cherokee struggle for justice did not end in courtrooms, but with the arrival of soldiers and forced relocation. In the spring of 1838, following orders from President Martin Van Buren, the military and state troops swarmed Cherokee homelands. Any time for debate or appeal had passed. The agreement signed by a few but opposed by many became law, and soldiers were sent to make it happen by force. Across Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, Cherokee families were forced out without warning. Troops arrived at doorsteps with fixed bayonets and urgent orders. People had only moments to gather a few possessions, sometimes nothing more than what they wore. Their homes were looted or burned, crops left to spoil. Churches, schools, and ancestral resting places, all were abandoned. Over 16,000 Cherokee were gathered into crowded camps, known as stockades. These places were dirty, packed, short on food and clean water, and offered no shelter from the weather. Sickness spread fast. Measles, dysentery, and whooping cough claimed many lives before the journey even began. Some Cherokee were moved quickly, under guard. Others remained trapped all summer, forced to wait for the fall, when officials thought travel conditions would be safer. But cold rains, early snow, and not enough food or supplies made things far worse. The Cherokee named the forced route Nuna Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. The path stretched up to 1,200 miles from their homes to the new territory. Their march was slow, painful, and humiliating. They walked through deep mud and over icy rivers, across mountains and endless prairie. The elderly stumbled, children died in the arms of their mothers, and entire families disappeared, buried along the trail in forgotten graves. Many tried to hold on to their dignity, singing prayers, carrying meaningful objects, and recording the names of loved ones. But grief was everywhere. Hunger drained their strength. Winter cut through thin clothes, and the guards showed scant pity. By the time the last Cherokee arrived in present-day Oklahoma, early in 1839, more than 4,000 had died, about 1 in 4. This was not simply a move, it was a tragedy, a deliberate breaking of home, heritage, and hope. When the final group reached the new territory that spring, the journey was over, but the pain continued. The losses along the Trail of Tears went beyond the thousands who died of hunger, cold, and sickness. What was lost was a way of life, a place of belonging, a spiritual bond with land, and a history stretching back generations. Those who survived reached their new lands weak, lonely, and grieving. The elders, keepers of tradition, had died. Children, symbols of the future, were gone. Leaders who had worked to protect their nation had given everything. There was little chance for mourning, no ceremonies for the dead. The area where they were resettled often felt strange and harsher than their old home. Promises made by the U.S. government for shelter, supplies, and farmland were often broken or poorly honored. Physical hardships were matched by deep emotional wounds. The Cherokee, once a proud nation of writers, teachers, and leaders, had placed their faith in the law. That faith had been shattered. After relocation, divisions grew among survivors. Those who had signed the earlier treaty were often viewed as traitors. In June of 1839, just months after arriving, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot were killed by fellow Cherokee in acts of revenge. Unity, already battered, was further weakened by grief and blame. Yet, amid all this loss, the Cherokee found a way to go on. They started new schools, rebuilt their government, and resumed publishing newspapers. They kept their language, their beliefs, and their stories alive. The same resilience that once drove them to use the courts now helped them survive in an unfamiliar world. Still, the scars of removal have never fully faded. The Trail of Tears lives on, not just in history books, but as a living memory, carried in stories, ceremonies, and family traditions. It is a memory of sorrow, but also of strength. Though the story of the Cherokee Trail of Tears is best remembered, it was not an isolated event. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 targeted several native nations, each with their own languages, cultures, and homelands, each suffering their own exile. The Choctaw were the first forced to leave, starting in 1831. Thousands walked from Mississippi and Alabama, mostly on foot without enough food or shelter. Many died in freezing weather and swollen rivers. One Choctaw leader called it a trail of tears and death, words that echoed across history. The Creek, a once mighty nation, were next. After years marked by broken promises and violent raids, over 15,000 Creeks were driven west in 1836, many in chains. Thousands died. Others were sold into bondage or separated from their families. The Chickasaw tried to secure fair payment for their lands before agreeing to move, but delays and neglect left them without resources. Hundreds died from disease and hunger on their journey. The Seminole of Florida fought most fiercely, waging a long war in the swamps from 1835 to 1842, with leaders like Osceola becoming symbols of refusal. Still, they could not resist forever. Thousands were captured, killed, or forced west, while others escaped deep into the Everglades, where their descendants live today. All told, more than 100,000 Native Americans were displaced by removal. Government policy called it progress. To Native peoples, it was disaster. Their trails varied, but the pain was constant. Broken trust, loss, and a sense of home and belonging torn away. But these nations carried with them not only grief, but also their languages, their songs, and their will to survive. When the relocated nations arrived in what is now Oklahoma, they found a land that felt unfamiliar and often harsh. The government's pledges of fertile soil, safety, and permanent ownership were soon undermined. The climate was different. Winters were colder, summer droughts dried up the ground. Families often arrived months apart, or not at all. Disease remained an ever-present threat. Cholera, smallpox, and influenza stalked their new settlements. The support the government had promised, tools, livestock, food, and funds, came too late, or not at all. Corruption and poor management made suffering even worse. What had been promised as safe land was quickly threatened again, as settlers and railroads moved west and the boundaries of states crept ever closer. Agreements were rewritten, sometimes under force or trickery, and native lands shrank again. Yet, even in new territory, people rebuilt what they could. The Cherokee created a new capital at Tahlequah, reopened schools, and rebuilt their cultural centers. The Choctaw and Chickasaw worked to reorganize their governments. New churches appeared, and slow healing began, not through forgetting, but by holding on. Still, the shadow of removal lingered. Every guarantee offered to protect their new settlements could, and did, break under pressure from greed and expansion. The land that was meant to be a permanent house became only a temporary refuge in a nation still unwilling to view native people as true neighbors. The story did not end in Indian territory. It simply began a new chapter of challenge, resilience, and effort to keep sovereignty alive. For many years after the forced journeys, the history of the Trail of Tears was quietly passed down within families, recounted in stories and ceremonies, but rarely acknowledged in larger society. It was a hidden wound, a pain known deeply by Native communities, but too often ignored by the wider nation. Still, the memory endured. Elders told of the march, of the hunger, the cold, and the loved ones lost. Songs were sung and names remembered. The very land held the imprint of the journey. Old paths, unmarked graves, records, and letters, all marked a passage carved into the heart of a continent. Yet for many this was not just a trail of sorrow, but also of survival. Faced with every attempt to erase their presence, these nations rebuilt, persevered, and kept their cultures alive. Over the decades, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole reestablished themselves. They founded new schools, published newspapers, taught their languages, and led governments. Against all odds, they survived. Still, the silence in the years that followed was heavy. Only in the late 20th century did the wider United States begin to reckon with this dark part of its past. Community leaders, teachers, and activists worked hard to restore the story to the nation's memory. Memorials were built. Markers were placed along the route. Slowly, the words "Trail of Tears" entered school books and national conversation. But remembering is not the same as making amends. The losses of removal are not finished. The separation from homelands, the generational trauma, and the weight of broken promises still affect Native communities. Yet even as they face ongoing struggles, the spirit of these nations endures. That same determination shown on the journey west finds new life in language preservation, cultural programs, and storytelling passed down by families. The Trail of Tears stands as more than a loss. It is about what was held on to, beliefs, memories, and a fierce drive to survive. Today, the Trail of Tears is not just a point in history, but a living reminder, a symbol of grief, endurance, and the courage to continue forward even when the world stands against you. The path that once carried so much pain has become sacred, a place for remembrance and honoring ancestors. Across the country, signs and museums mark the journey. The Trail of Tears, National Historic Trail, recognized by Congress in 1987, spans over 5,000 miles through 9 states, following the routes taken by those forced west. It winds through woods, meadows, and towns, inviting anyone willing to pause and walk in the footsteps of those who endured. But truly honoring history goes beyond monuments. For the families descended from those who walked the trail, memory lives on in community gatherings, language classes, and sacred ceremonies. Through annual tributes, storytelling, and programs that revive traditional ways, they keep the history alive for new generations. What was once nearly erased is now spoken with pride. Schools teach the story. Artists and writers give it new voice. Young people grow up knowing their history is rooted not only in struggles, but also in courage and the persistence of culture. Still, remembering the Trail of Tears is not enough. The story stands as a challenge for the present, asking us to face the real price of growth and recognize the people who paid it. It asks us to look closely at the tragic cost of policy shaped by greed or fear, and to recognize that so-called progress without fairness is not progress, but loss. To truly honor the Trail of Tears is to go beyond remembering. It means listening, learning, and making space for voices once silenced. America's story remains incomplete without its native peoples, past, present, and for every generation yet to come. And so, we remember, not only in sadness, but with deep respect. For even as everything was taken from them, these people walked forward. They did not disappear. They endured. In the icy beginnings of 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts, was a place full of tension. Surrounded by thick forest, this Puritan village was not just a small group of homes. It was a community struggling with spiritual fear and social conflict. The people of Salem saw themselves as chosen by God to build a pure life in an unpredictable land. But beneath their faith, years of worry and discord simmered. Strict religion ruled every part of daily life. The Puritans believed unseen forces, angels, demons, the devil, shaped the world. They thought evil was real and ever-threatening. Witches, in their minds, could make pacts with the devil, bringing harm to the whole community. To question these ideas was to doubt the very foundation of their lives. Their minister, Samuel Parris, was especially intense, critical, suspicious, and always on guard for sin. His warning sermons split the church, dividing families and neighbors alike. Beyond religion, Salem felt economic and political pressures. Long-running arguments separated Salem Village from the nearby, wealthier Salem town. Property lines, personal grudges, and beliefs all clashed in ways that blurred simple boundaries. The village also lived with outside dangers. Memories of violent attacks during King Philip's War were still fresh. Failed crops and an outbreak of smallpox added to their sense of doom. For the Puritans, disaster was not an accident, but a punishment sent for hidden wrongs. Into this charged atmosphere, a group of young girls began to act in unusual, even alarming ways. Their fits, strange cries, and claims of witchcraft would soon spiral far beyond ordinary childhood mischief. In Salem, the devil was a real presence, and it wasn't hard to believe he had arrived. It began, as many tragedies do, with children. In January 1692, two young girls, 9-year-old Betty Paris and her cousin, 11-year-old Abigail Williams, started to behave in disturbing ways. They screamed, twisted their bodies, imitated animals, and made odd noises. When scolded, they screamed they were being hurt by invisible hands. Reverend Paris, Betty's father, didn't know what to do. A local doctor, William Griggs, saw the signs and gave his diagnosis: witchcraft. In deeply religious and superstitious Salem, no explanation could have been more chilling. Soon, other girls in the village began showing similar symptoms. Anne Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard joined the first two. Their suffering seemed real, and their families were well respected, giving their accusations power. When pressed to name who was causing their pain, the girls accused 3 women: Tituba, an enslaved Caribbean woman who lived in the Paris household; Sarah Good, a poor and often homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, who was frowned upon for missing church and marrying her servant. Each was vulnerable in a different way, and all 3 suddenly faced the full suspicion of the community. They were arrested and thrown in jail. For the people of Salem, this was more than an illness. It was a crisis that had to be stopped. And from that moment, suspicion spread rapidly. No one, family, friend, or neighbor, could feel truly safe as fear took over. As more villagers fell into fits and more names were whispered, the local courts adopted a new kind of evidence: spectral evidence. This was the belief that a witch could send her spirit to torment victims, regardless of where the accused person actually was. In packed courtrooms, the afflicted girls cried out, claiming to see these apparitions inflicting pain while the accused stood helpless in front of them. For those in Salem, these claims were not seen as play acting. They were accepted as proof, a sure sign of evil alliances. If the accused denied the charges, they were called liars. If they remained silent, that too counted against them. On the other hand, those who confessed, and named others, often avoided execution, making false confession a tempting option. Tituba, the first accused, offered a dramatic confession. She told of a dark visitor from Boston, clearly meant to represent the devil, who promised her freedom for service. She spoke of strange creatures and a witch's book, supposedly signed by other villagers. Whether she confessed to save herself or out of confusion, her testimony intensified the panic. If witches could hide anywhere, no one was safe. Soon, others confessed, sometimes through force, others in hope for mercy. Those who held fast to their innocence often suffered most. In the dim courthouses, truth and rumor mingled until reason was drowned by fear. Ministers sometimes pleaded for restraint, but their voices were too often unheard. Jails filled with the accused. Farmers, housewives, even children. As spring arrived, Salem's prisons overflowed. What had begun as an isolated scare became a legal and social crisis. with more than 100 imprisoned and the colony uncertain how to stem the panic. The governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, stepped in, setting up a special court of oyer and terminer to handle the cases. These proceedings bent the rules of evidence to fit the moment, accepting visions and hearsay while questioning any doubt as dangerous. The first person formally tried and executed was Bridget Bishop. Known for her colorful clothes and sharp tongue, she was an easy scapegoat. Accusers claimed she tormented them even as she stood before the court, and when she denied all blame, this denial was taken as further evidence. She was found guilty and hanged on June 10, 1692, the first of many. After Bishop's death, the cycle of accusation, trial, and execution quickened. Week by week, neighbors, churchgoers, leaders, and the community's most vulnerable took their turns before the court. Some were respected, others marginalized, but guilt often rested simply on suspicion, poor luck, or old grudges. Those who confessed and implicated others were generally spared. Those who stood by innocence were far more likely to be hanged. Fear infected everything. Families turned against themselves. Friends and neighbors testified to protect their own. Even cautioning ministers became suspects. A gallows was built in silence on a hill above Salem, waiting as the town below fed it names, one trial at a time. As spring faded to summer, all of Essex County was gripped by mass hysteria. The witch hunt moved beyond Salem, with towns like Ipswich, Andover, and Gloucester falling into panic. Accusations came from all sides. Both outsiders and community members found themselves in chains. Children as young as 5 were arrested. The wife of a minister became a target. Whole families ended up behind bars. Even questioning the reality of witches could bring accusation. Much of this frenzy centered on the public performances of the afflicted girls. In court, they cried, claimed to see strange animals, echoed the accused, and even fainted together. However unusual their stories seemed, the judges treated them as trustworthy proof. By the end of summer, over 150 people were in jail, and the hangings continued. Sarah Good, a homeless woman, refused to confess and was executed. Her steadfastness was described by some not as courage, but as rebellion against God. Even Rebecca Nurse, a kindly grandmother and respected church member, was found guilty and hanged, shaking the community's sense that piety offered any safety. Through all this, reason fell away. What began as a curious set of symptoms had become a nightmare, with fear itself taking over as Salem's ruler. As summer turned to autumn, the Salem witch trials reached their bleakest moment. The gallows on Proctor's Ledge became a grim stage, drawing whole towns to witness the deaths. For some, these events were heavy with grief. For others, they became a kind of public entertainment. 19 people in all were hanged as witches, 14 women and 5 men, all claiming innocence and many dying with prayers on their lips. None were given proper burials. The bodies of the condemned were left in shallow graves, or, if reclaimed, were taken under the quiet of night. The cruelest fate befell Giles Corey, an elderly farmer and husband of another accused woman, Martha Corey. Refusing to plead guilty or not guilty in court, he hoped to protect his property for his family. Instead, he was punished by pressing, placed beneath heavy stones, weight added slowly, until he died. According to those present, his last words were simply, "More weight." All the while, those still imprisoned, pregnant women, mothers, and the sick, suffered in awful conditions. Families had to pay just to keep their loved ones fed in jail, and some remained behind bars long after the trials had ended. By September, something began to change. It was not a single event that ended the panic, but a slow, growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Hanging respected citizens like Rebecca Nurse or John Proctor shocked the community. Could anyone truly be safe? When the wife of the colony's former governor and other prominent churchgoers were accused, the fear began to touch even society's highest ranks. Reverend Increase Mather, a leading minister and father to Cotton Mather, spoke publicly against relying on spectral evidence. "It is better that 10 suspected witches escape," he declared, "than one innocent person suffer." This marked a change in tone, a quiet criticism of the court's actions. Other ministers began speaking out. Families pleaded for their relatives. Communities nearby, watching events unfold, started to distance themselves. Under growing criticism, Governor Phipps ended the special witch court in October 1692. A new court, with stricter rules and no spectral evidence, cleared most remaining prisoners. Executions stopped. But Salem as a whole remained deeply shaken. In the end, 19 were hanged, 1 pressed to death, and over 100 spent time imprisoned, their lives and families forever changed. Even as the last prisoners were released in 1693, Salem as a community carried a heavy burden of regret. Over the following years, those involved in the trials struggled with their actions. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, offered a rare public apology during a day of fasting and prayer, standing before a Boston church to ask forgiveness for his role. Some participants stayed silent, holding firm to their belief that they acted rightly. Even Cotton Mather, who had once supported the use of spectral evidence, softened his view over time. In 1706, one of the original accusers, Ann Putnam, Jr., confessed before her church, expressing sorrow that her words had helped cause the deaths of innocent people and seeking forgiveness. Families of the victims spent years working to clear names. In 1711, Massachusetts lawmakers restored rights to many of those convicted and paid compensation to some families, though not everyone received justice. For decades, children grew up in the shadow of the trials. Despite Salem's efforts to heal, its memory became a warning. This was what happened when fear overtook reason, and when accusation replaced fairness in the courts. Centuries have now passed, but the impact of the Salem witch trials remains. The story serves as a warning about what happens when fear becomes contagious, justice is abandoned, and belief overtakes evidence. The phrase witch trials lives on as a symbol of cycles of panic and false accusations, cited in courtrooms and classrooms whenever society risks turning on itself. Today, Salem recognizes its history, offering museums, memorials, and tours to visitors from around the world. The Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated 3 centuries later, stands in the center of town with benches carved with the names, dates, and last words of the executed, reminding us that their only crime was dignity in the face of injustice. But Salem's story is more than a matter of tourism or legend. It's a reflection of our shared humanity. The trials reveal how easily fear can spread, how power can be misused in the name of virtue, and how justice can fail when emotion replaces evidence. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, made this lesson vivid for modern times, reminding us that witch hunts need not include witches at all, and that the lessons of the past are always nearby. The descendants of both the accused and the accusers still live in Massachusetts and beyond. Some feel the weight of what happened. Others are sustained by the example of endurance and hope. In 2001, more than 300 years after the gallows fell silent, Massachusetts cleared the names of the final 5 victims, completing the official process of exoneration. The trials themselves lasted just over a year, but their lessons continue. They remind us to defend the truth, even when frightened voices call out for blood, and that the gravest wrongs can be committed under the full light of day, when justice forgets compassion.